What's going on, everybody? Today, we're going to talk about the Civil War. Um, to talk about the Civil War, we have to understand that the fugitive slaves and the abolitionists, the benefit or how they took control of the war and how they changed the whole trajectory single-handedly of what the United States and North America was all about. In the North and in the South, both sides, none of them cared even the slightest about slavery. And they both had their own agendas. The North agenda was to reunite the South. The South agenda was to continue enslavement. But the South knew they couldn't continue slavery if they combined with the North, at least not in that way. So this led to great divide between the North and the South, and the South decided that they were going to secede from the North. So then the North passed laws or was writing to the South telling them that we're going to reunify the North and the South. However, we're not going to free any slaves. We're going to continue with we're going to let you continue enslaving, but we're going to continue to do our business our way. So the South wasn't really going. I mean, their immorality. They still didn't unite with the North out of fear of them losing their slaves. So this was a great divide, and eventually it led to a first strike, which was caused by the fugitives. That actually led to the Civil War. So it's really interesting to see how the fugitive slaves inspired the freedom of their fellow brothers that were enslaved, and how they kept promoting it, how they kept trying to do everything they could to incite a slave rebellion or freedom of enslavement. And then when the chance actually presented itself, took full throttle and incited the Civil War. The South took the first shot at the declaration of war, and the Civil War began. And the North wasn't fully prepared. Well, I guess you could say they were to go to war. They didn't want war. The North was comprised of free workers. You had the immigrant workers, right? The immigrant workers would include the European workers, right? So now you also had your freedmen, or not freedmen, I'm sorry. You had your free Negroes, is what they would call them. And as well as you had the fugitives and abolitionists. So the thing is, there was such great tension within the North at this time because immigrant workers or the European workers, they hated the blacks. They hated us because we were hired for less in their economy in the North. We worked for less, and we were able to build our communities really well using this tactic of being hired for less. We would work for them, basically take the money that we earn and put it to our community. But the European workers envied us and they hated us because they're fleeing from Europe or coming from Europe, and they're coming from Europe trying to get better job opportunities and all this, right? But they get here and they realize that, okay, the free Negroes are here and working, and we have to try to fit in with them. And they didn't like that. They hated that. So overall, it was a racist thing because at the same time, they didn't want to free any slaves in the South. But at the same time, they wanted slavery, but if they would have chosen to actually free the slaves and actually like stand with the abolitionists and fugitive slaves, they would have had better job opportunities, because now you're not fighting against the slave for job opportunities. You can't beat that. So it was a racist thing. The European immigrants, they were racist above all, and they created the white mobs, the mobs of the North, and this is where you get your burning down of buildings, hanging, and all of these different types of things from the mob. This is actually originated with European workers coming through and not being able to find and not being able to beat out the blacks of the North, and then in their frustration decided that they were just going to use their numbers and gang up and try to incite all this violence. But so this was going on in the North. There was fights and contentions and back and forth with free Negroes and fugitives and abolitionists with these European workers. You had the government and the businessmen and the corporate business owners who were kind of running everything in the North. They're what you would call your quote-unquote slave holders. They were basically the ones who ruled in the North. You would go to them for the jobs. You would work for them, and they were the ones that were hiring you and setting the price and doing all this. But I do believe that in the North, though, free Negroes, or eventually at some point you could hire or set your own wages. But I believe the conditions of those jobs were brutal and sometimes would be described as worse than slavery by the South, though. I believe that I honestly believe the North was a modernized form of slavery. It wasn't like the South, where the South was just straight, brutal slavery and horrible conditions and chains and whips and all this types of things. I think the North was more so of a modernized form of enslavement, but we took full advantage of that in the North. The fugitive slaves, they were very powerful, and they had so much influence because they would not only free themselves from the slave masters. Harriet Tubman would be the key person in this with the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, she created a lot of fugitives. She freed a lot of slaves. So with this, the fugitives a lot of fugitives would continue fighting to free everyone else and work with abolitionists and like Frederick Douglass. And there were many events that took place. I know Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and John Brown got together. They were speaking. They spoke with Abraham Lincoln. So the fugitive slaves were incredibly active in the freedom of enslavement in the South, almost like the revolutionaries you see today are in Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, right? So this was your back in the day leaders. It would be these fugitive slaves. So when we look at the impact that they had on this sense, they put fear into the South, right? They put fear into the South because the South was promoting, it would publicize how bad they did that. The North wanted to end slavery, but really the North only never wanted to end slavery. The North was just they were just trying to reunite the South. So under their system. So the North passed laws and were passing laws saying that we're not going to end slavery. We're going to continue enslavement underneath our system. So get with the program. But the South continued to publicize and make it publicly with the public image. They decided they were going to paint the picture that the North and the South, or the North was trying to end slavery, which shows you how much in fear they were of the end of slavery. So when the war started, the South, or the fugitives, kicked it off. And when the fugitives kicked it off, the North wasn't ready for it. They were not, or at least they didn't want it. This was not the plan. Things didn't go according to plan when the war actually got kicked off. And when the war got kicked off, fugitive slaves were automatically, instantly freeing themselves. The thing about when slavery, when as soon as the Civil War started, the slave system had ended instantly, right then and there. There was already slave rebellions, and every time the Union stepped onto a plantation, it was a slave rebellion, and it was over with right there. So this is what was going on all throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. It was Union march down, step on the plantation, slave rebellion, over with. Or it would be the Union march down, step on the slave plantation, and the slaves had already overthrew the master, and it was already on. The slaves had already took it over, right? So most of the marching down from Virginia and the Carolinas looked like this. And the fugitives and the freedmen were starting to join those armies. But what the Union did, they wouldn't allow the Union Army. We have to put it in proper perspective. So the Union Army saw the slaves as slaves. They were just as racist as the South, but they saw black people just as the South did. But they believed in a different way of authority, a different way of ruling, right? So when they marched down and they saw all the fugitives, they contemplated with themselves, like, what are we going to do with all of these slaves? And what they did was they took those slaves as contraband, and they were made to work for the Union Army in as servants, as spies, and things of this nature. They weren't yet given weapons just yet, because Abraham Lincoln didn't wasn't approving of that. So as they continued to march down and free more slaves, and more of them joined the army, this became the strategy for the North. The undeniable, easy, and inevitable strategy to take the slaves, because that's the whole power of the South. It's run by slaves. So if you take the slaves from right under them, then it's pretty much a walk in the park. But however, it didn't go according to plan, because many of the immigrant workers, or they couldn't find many people to join the war in the North. The immigrant workers weren't really interested in the war. Many of the working classes wasn't interested in the war. They weren't going to participate in it. So this started to have an effect on the Union, and the Union was actually about to lose the war, because they couldn't get people to enlist in the war. So inevitably they had to start arming the slaves. So when they started arming slaves, that kind of ended the war right there, because it was now that you arm the slaves, it's like basically telling the man who was just enslaved to kill his master. So it was a very, very brutal, emotional, personal, and most gory war that ever took place. And I personally think the fugitive slaves are the biggest heroes that ever stepped on the planet, because to what they did in the war, not only did they incite the war and put fear into the South and actually tip the war off, but when they got armed, they were on the front line. They weren't in the back. They weren't it wasn't a thing where, okay, we're fighting side by side with the Union, or we're just helping the Union. No, when they got armed, they were put on the front line. All of them. If you were black, you were on the front line, and you were the one taking all the heat, taking all the shots, and giving all the shots at the same time. So it's kind of like how it is nowadays with the army, especially in like the Vietnam War. We're the ones put at the forefront of the war. That's what happened in the Civil War as well. But we didn't mind it, because it was personal. So when we had black commanders and lieutenants, and they would take their troops throughout the lower parts of the Carolinas and Georgia and deep into the South, and it was the same thing that was pretty much going on. When you get to the plantation, and there's already a slave revolt happening. A lot of the places that they went to in the Carolinas and in Virginia, there was already black authoritative structure going on in those areas by the fugitives. So as you get deeper down into the South, we lost a lot of great men, because we were getting shot in the back by the Union, as well as getting shot in the front by the South. We were caught in between two sides of gunfire, the Union was shooting through us to hit the South, to hit the Southern soldiers, and we were put on the front line of it, and where there was landmines or whatever it was, we were put on the front lines of it, and we had to endure it. So, but eventually, as I would say, this war was won by the fugitives. Because not only did they incite the war, they took over this entire war and they freed everybody, even when we got to Mississippi. When we got to Mississippi, Mississippi was very, as they would describe it, the generals described Mississippi as something that it was the most unsightly thing that they had ever seen. Slaves were uneducated, unfed, unclothed, and essentially they had just went through the worst. Like, the best way I can describe Mississippi is something out of a dungeon. Really coming from the dungeon with no food, no water. The conditions were that bad, and the slaves were treated that immoral. People were treated that immorally. Like, you were not a human being. You weren't even a living being. They treated you as a resource, literally, a disposable resource at that. So Mississippi is a crazy place to be. That's a crazy note. And the thing about the Union, how they saw it was, they saw it like, okay, so the North, we had just went from Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas, and these fugitives and these slaves are offering services to us to fight in the war. That's the only way that we were able to even join the Union Army. It's because when we freed ourselves from slavery, we weren't looking for them for help. We were looking to join the army and to continue fighting down through the South and freeing everybody else. That was our mentality going throughout everywhere from the Carolinas and Virginia, Maryland. That was our mentality, right? But then when you get to Mississippi, the only thing that is on everybody's mind is people aren't even the only thing, people are just looking for help. This is what people wanted in Mississippi. Like, people were just looking for help. Somebody help me, because I'm in a condition so bad that I can't even help myself, right? The people in Mississippi, they said it was to be the most unsightly thing, but these people couldn't even help themselves. So the fugitives had to take on the burdens of the Mississippi resident, or the Mississippi people. The fugitives had to take on their burdens, and they had to take care of them. They had to give them. They had health programs and health things, and they had to nurture them back to reasonable health in Mississippi. So the one thing that I can say about the Civil War is that throughout the war, we really took care of ourselves. You had so many great generals, though. You did have generals who were very interactive with the slaves. One of which being General Hunter. General Hunter, when we were starting to fall back from the war because we couldn't get too many Northerners to actually participate in the war. General Hunter was trying to speak to, was trying to write. He was writing to Abraham Lincoln, and they told them that they kept sending him back and forth. Like he said, "Yo, I need some men. I need soldiers. Like, can y'all help? Can y'all send some soldiers? Like, what are y'all doing? I'm in the thick of the war in Georgia." And basically, the North and the secretary in the North, they sent back to General Hunter that just make do for now. Yeah, or we can't send any more men, just make do. Or just, this is what they were writing back to General Hunter. General Hunter actually was the first to arm the slaves, I believe. And he went against the Northern Army, or he went against the North, because the North said don't arm any slaves, but defend its position in the thick of the Confederacy. General Hunter, he was the one that actually first armed the slaves and said, "Hey, these folks make good soldiers right here." So it was General Hunter that had the major influence as well on the arming of us in the war, because he ain't had no choice. So this is that's an honorable mention, but the point I'm trying to make though is that the fugitives, we helped ourselves in the war. We weren't looking for handouts. The fugitives are the ones that actually kicked off the war. The war was originally, it had nothing to do with slaves. It had everything to do with reuniting or uniting the South into the North system. The North had a system they wanted, and they were trying to unite the South to that system. And the South just wanted slavery, so they succeeded. I think we're going to end right there. We're going to make this probably like a 2 or 3 part course. So tune in. I'll see y'all.